I'm sick of all this warmongering and won't stay silent or let myself look bad. Marjan, and I hope that my years as a war correspondent in Donbass, as someone who has been directly, practically living inside a war conflict, I'm still in Donbass right now and reporting from here. I hope that my experience helps as many people as possible open their eyes. Because today, I'm here to show you never-before-seen images of what we will inevitably have to experience. The vast majority of people who have even the slightest connection to this conflict. Tensions are rising between the European Union and the Russian Federation, as we are already experiencing NATO's war against Russia on Ukrainian soil. But now the European Union's warmongering madness is reaching its highest level. There are several countries that are reporting their willingness, from here on out, to even introduce compulsory military service. We're talking about Germany, we're talking about Belgium, and we'll look at some more specific cases in a moment. But above all, what we're talking about are some very specific conditions, which everyone who wants to go to war against the Russian Federation will necessarily have to go through. To be clear, impossible. I'll repeat, I'm taking something from my archive to show you. Unreleased images of what it really means to get involved right now in a military conflict of this scale. I hope you're ready for what's coming next, because this is the graphic evidence of what awaits those NATO mobilizers. Mobilizers, now, supposedly to protect the borders of the European Union, that on a day like today, the Ukrainian population, without wanting it or wishing for it, could end up directly on the front line. So, the reality is going to be what I'm going to tell you next. I'm Liu Sivaya, a Donbass war correspondent and geopolitical analyst. Subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with the latest international news, including the Ukrainian conflict, but above all, so that Western propaganda never fools you or drags you into an absolutely unnecessary war. We begin, as usual, from the beginning, with a bit of context, and then we go straight to the footage. As you probably know, the increasingly warlike rhetoric of the European Union, of the collective West in general, but especially of the European Union, is becoming more and more obvious. In this regard, several countries have already spoken out about it. First of all, in Germany, they are talking about some medical exams that the population will have to undergo from now on. Starting at the age of 18, of course, we're talking about those who will go to do military service, which for now is not going to be mandatory, not at all, according to the German government. They'll volunteer, but it's the government itself. In fact, they add that if there aren't enough volunteers, well, then yes, we are indeed going to be talking about obligation. We will be talking about obligation, yes, and also about a very curious kind of obligation, since military service could become mandatory in Germany. By lottery, yes, basically, like now being on an electoral board in Spain, which, clearly, for the European Union, is becoming almost the same as ending up participating in an armed conflict. In Belgium, things are progressing similarly. The government of the country has already sent no less than 149,000 letters to the population starting at age 17. In particular, I actually think, to the population of 17-year-olds. Well, indeed, to try to recruit those volunteers for military service, which is still not mandatory. But everything points to the fact that, indeed, it could end up being mandatory. In Poland, it's more of the same. Politicians are already laying the groundwork, and they're saying that it's absolutely impossible, absolutely necessary, to return to mandatory military service to protect the borders of the European Union. Yes, seriously, protect. Perhaps the one who describes it best is the Serbian president, and here I quote directly, everyone is preparing for a possible war between Europe and Russia. As I analyze the facts, I come to the conclusion that war between Europe and Russia is becoming more and more obvious. This is not empty news. Everyone is already preparing for it. This was stated by an extremely responsible general. This quote belongs to the leader of Serbia, Mr. Vučić, who confessed that the country was finding itself in an extremely delicate position, like being between a rock and a hard place. Dmitry Peskov also confirms that in Russia they are indeed aware of this trend. Moscow shares the opinion of Serbian President Vučić about the rise of pro-military sentiments in Europe. The increase in the military budgets of European countries leads to excessive strain on their economies and to more serious consequences. At the same time, the Russian Federation has always understood that there is a danger of war and has taken measures for its own security. I would like to add that, of course, it will continue to take measures for its own security, but here, beyond the security of the Russian Federation, which ultimately is an independent and sovereign country that in fact is already defending that very sovereignty, facing the entire NATO on Ukrainian territory. We must talk about the security of those whom they are trying to sell at all costs. The narrative that the ever-increasing and rampant militarization of the European Union is the only way, and that confronting the Russian Federation is the only possible outcome. European politicians, however, insist this will happen, simply because that's how the Russian Federation is going to act. From Russia, Vladimir Putin once again confirms that there is no intention whatsoever to attack NATO or any of its members.
Should they tighten their belts, countering Russia, forgetting about their own interests, sacrificing them, and acting in their own detriment? But, the ruling elites of United Europe try to stoke up hysteria. They say that war is in the offing, and they keep repeating that gibberish over and over again. I look and hear what has been said, and I'm bewildered. Can they be serious? Can they really believe what they're saying, that Russia is trying to attack them? This is impossible to believe. And they try to convince their own people of that, and they may be incompetent, just incompetent if they believe in that, because it's impossible to believe in this nonsense. Or they may be decent enough because they do not believe in that themselves, but try to convince their own people. Just calm down and sleep quietly and try to get to grips with your problems.
Is promoting, therefore, the bellicose madness. I think it is more than clear, and here are several points to highlight before going directly to the images that I promise will leave you absolutely speechless. First of all, everything mentioned above represents a change of paradigm. In fact, the total and absolute failure of the previous paradigm. Two, to be exact, the military and the social. On the one hand, to bet everything on the idea of smaller, but also more professional armies, giving up mandatory military service. By the way, that's still as strong in the Russian Federation as it was years ago. Now, with the facts in hand, we can already say quite clearly that on the part of the European Union, it was a grave mistake. At one point, it was thought that technologies would end up solving any conflict, and that whoever had the greatest access to these same technologies would end up winning any conflict. But you see, the main principle of current wars is that wars are still won on the battlefield. Thus, the infantry holds the most important role among them all. It has been costly, but in the European Union, they are finally stepping into the ring and starting to understand it. But in addition to the failure of its military model, it is also failing badly in many other areas. Here we won't discuss economic or other aspects, but we'll focus only on the social model, the 2030 Agenda commitment, and these new ideologies that are doing anything but giving back to the people of the countries of the most patriotic union. They put the beautiful European garden in a very delicate position, basically in a breach. And if what is wanted is to carry out these waves of mandatory mobilization one after another to end up facing the Russian Federation on the battlefield, several issues must be addressed, but in social terms, mainly two. Therefore, we need to answer two absolutely key questions: who can fight and who is going to win? Case? We are referring to both groups within the European spectrum. Both the left and the right will have quite a few reservations when it comes to going to the front. The left has largely accepted the 2030 agenda and woke ideology, so it is no longer in fighting condition. Because yes, it may be that now someone discovers the bicycle. Attending gay pride and going to war are two different things. Let's say directly opposed. On the other hand, who would want to go to the front? Here we have to talk about the right wing, which for the most part simply can't see or even sense this Agenda 2030, and in fact, it would be delighted with the total collapse of what now represents the European Union. Therefore, why would they go to the front lines to defend their values? Yes, having seen the precedents, indeed, placed between the new Patriot mobilization plan, first voluntary, then probably mandatory, and it could end up being total. What I would like to highlight here, and this is exactly why I am doing what I am doing, this video is mainly about how hard the conditions end up being at the front. Because the vast majority of the population of the European Union, until the conflict, couldn't even locate Ukraine on the map. And for this, in fact, I don't blame them. I don't judge them. I don't criticize them. It's completely normal since Ukraine doesn't really matter to them. What happens is that Western propaganda has made them believe the opposite. But this is exactly where all the danger lies. Now, all the propaganda machinery, very Western, is doing everything possible to convince them of that. All these steps, mobilizing the population, investing as much as possible in armaments, building a supposedly strong and practically invincible defense, especially against the insignificant Russian Federation, can end up bringing them, without them wanting it, to the same point where the Ukrainians are today, fighting to the last European. In Russia, we say that being warned means being armed. So here, in the form of graphic images, directly from Donbass, is my personal warning. I have been covering the conflict in Ukraine since then, and in total, I will have lived here for more than a year. I have literally seen everything. Warning, some images may be disturbing, but they're not intended to be morbid. My work has never actually gone morbid, but precisely to warn the Western population, who end up waiting until it's too late if they don't wake up and say enough. We do not want to go to any war, because this war of the European Union against the Russian Federation is now being pushed by the Western media. The Second World War happened a long time ago, and what is happening right now in Ukraine is the most similar to it, something that the European population has practically completely forgotten. Here are the images of the largest factories in Mariupol, which has probably been one of the most symbolic places at the time it was taken by the army of the Russian Federation. The first and most obvious thing they show us is the state of destruction.
We're in the Ilichan. Has recently been evicted by the troops of the Donetsk People's Republic and also of the Russian army.
That is a war with the characteristics of today, which has the strength of the Ukrainian conflict and destroys absolutely everything in its path. Both sides, of course, have had to go through a real hell. Bombs, falling missiles, flying drones that now practically control all the available airspace. Hunger, thirst, tremendous medical conditions. These are just small signs of what it actually means to enter into a total. These are the conditions you see in the images, and this is what the vast majority of Ukrainian soldiers are experiencing. At the Ilich factory, the soldiers of the 36th Brigade were the ones who fought. They suffered a significant defeat. This image is... I picked a less graphic one and may need to cover parts of it. These mountains of corpses were the usual sight in practically every corner of that factory. There was no space. The improvised morgues that had been set up inside couldn't hold any more.
There was no place to put them. There was nowhere to go. There were birds in the furniture. My legs hurt. There was nowhere to go. So,
Ukrainian soldiers with catheters, with tracks, legs without heads, the vast majority of them in a state of advanced rot, were lying piled up in any free space there was.
Some of the civilians dressed.
They changed. Some of them changed to camouflage themselves.
Two, of course, add the conditions in which these soldiers had to fight, and therefore they also had to live. Perhaps in this sense, the most representative that I have seen, and what surely is not imagined. Let's not go far. The images we could record in Azovstal are not from the West. At that time, journalists still had no access to the factory in question. In fact, very few ended up getting there. But we were able to enter, and as you can see in the images, what we found there was total destruction. A massive place, just as vast as it was inhospitable.
We are still standing in Azovstal. Look how absolutely huge this is. It's like a city inside another city, which is Mariupol, which
Housed bodies in bulk, burned equipment, all kinds. To be taken, rats, cockroaches. Look.
Here, still. Some ammunition. These are grenades. Actually, it's water. They did have water and food. You find anything?
We found what was in the neighboring cellars and plantings, wherever we could find something. It's the same with cigarettes, food, water, everything. We didn't throw them away because our FPVs were hitting them on the ground. 2 or 3 pieces, if that. So how many positions are there? The guy said no one delivers by radio. I heard. We hid in basements and bushes. If someone tried to run over there, something, well, FPVs or cover or with this or mortar. And we were told, sit down, everything is fine. Like this one report, everything will be fine. We will take you out and so on. No, nothing. Then the guys came in. I asked them, are they Russian? They said, yes. They asked, will you surrender or not? I said, well, will you? Well, will you be marked there? They said no. I said, well, all right, I'll surrender my weapon. I just realized that, well, we were abandoned and, well, it was already useless. Lie on the ground as you are since you were abandoned. Slept.
Where you ate, and when you could sleep, because of the state of destruction you see. Look.
That's where the beds were. It's all full of ash, everything, I mean. Impressive.
The place speaks of the constant and massive attacks by the Russian Federation. There, the Brazilian Air Force flew hundreds. In fact, the Ukrainian military themselves, who ended up surrendering because Azovstal was completely surrounded. From there, 2,500 Ukrainian military came out. Among them, in fact, the vast majority were Azov militants. That is, the toughest guys in all of Ukraine admitted that what they had experienced was hell on earth. They were hungry, cold, thirsty, and most of all afraid. Usually they hid in basements, and in fact, when they ended up being evacuated by the Ukrainian regime, well, when they surrendered to the Russian Federation, they tried to burn the vast majority of military equipment so that Russia could not keep it. They had to then live with that constant smoke. Many were tremendously affected. Psychologically, but also, of course, there were no necessary means to treat the wounded. The suffering that was lived and breathed there in every centimeter was total, and it continued to remain in that place, even after all those soldiers had left. Well,
no one has seen this. I'm not sure if they came in through this door or the other one. Don't know if they have this door. No. Had seen. I never imagined it. Children, put it here. I'm here, right in the catacombs. Let's see where we are. I'm walking on ash. I think there's nothing else. I think it's burned. Look.
There are many wounded and dead. Being surrounded, we don't have nearly enough bandages.
We already knew that we were being hit by waves of men, by destruction. In short, there was a way back. I
assure you that when we arrived, the place was still under development, demined in some areas. Remains of Ukrainian soldiers could be found, both alive and dead, because certainly there needs to be a thorough search to see if any soldier who was left behind tried to escape. For example, to Mariupol through there, maybe even to the Russian Federation, or back to Ukraine. They could still be in the factory, wherever it was. And when we arrived, I was absolutely overwhelmed by what we saw there. They were literally living among the filth. Maybe it sounds harsh, but that's how it was. I'm not here to flatter you. I'm here to tell you the reality of a war conflict, and I hope this helps people become aware of what could happen to their children, husbands, and brothers, in the event that the reckless politicians of the European Union end up dragging their countries into an open conflict against the Russian Federation. War is not beautiful, but the armies that are now trying, through rapid mobilization, currently voluntary, but very likely to become mandatory in the end, will prepare these men for the reality that I am showing you in these images. The only two armies that have experienced real war, the one most similar to the Second World War, are currently the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. None, except of course the crazy politicians of the SEO, to continue fighting in this conflict. They know that it is absolutely inevitable that an agreement has, but they are forced to stay in the front until Zelensky gives his arm to twist or basically has to capitulate. And no, I'm even going to give here the argument that the Russian army is one of the greatest, one of the most powerful, one of the best trained, the one with the experience in the field of real battle. Today, all this is useless for absolutely nothing. That is the main point. The main point is, in fact, the European Union, whose population is simply not prepared to live in these conditions, much less to fight in them. I would say that the vast majority are not prepared for it, not even the military of the European Union, nor talk about the civilians who can manage to mobilize either. Deceiving them or simply forcing them to such a thing. There is knowledge, sufficient experience. There is not enough time to prepare. If the plan truly is to start the war in 2030, this cannot be achieved or mobilized now in a total and mandatory way to the vast majority of young people in Europe, simply because these newly mobilized need training, need to get used to their new reality. But above all, once they arrive in the field of battle, they are, perhaps, for example, in the Baltic countries. This may actually explain why they were so happily annexed to the European Union. Citizens of countries with different languages, different cultures, different ways of seeing and understanding the world, who will have to join a single army, organize themselves practically, momentarily, and face one of the greatest military powers today. The images of what this would mean, the children of the European Union, I think they already speak for themselves. So I'm going to finish this report by paraphrasing a famous phrase that I like a lot. Let whoever is without sin cast the first stone, or whoever is free from the desire to live takes the first shot?